The story of Benito Juárez begins in the rugged Sierra de Ixtlan, in the state of Oaxaca, one of the most culturally rich yet socioeconomically marginalized regions of Mexico. Born on March 21, 1806, in the small village of San Pablo Galateo, Juárez entered the world as a member of the Zapotec indigenous community. His early life was defined by poverty, isolation, and the profound weight of colonial legacy. At that time, indigenous populations in Mexico were still largely excluded from economic power, education, and political representation. Juárez's birth into this environment made his eventual rise all the more extraordinary and historically significant. Orphaned at the age of 3, Juárez was taken in by his uncle. But the economic limitations of his family meant that he had to contribute to agricultural labor from a young age. He was a shepherd boy, tending animals in the mountains, and he did not speak Spanish until his adolescence. His native language was Zapotec, reflecting the linguistic and cultural richness of the indigenous world from which he came. The language barrier and lack of formal early education positioned him among the least likely individuals to ever participate in the elite circles of 19th century Mexican politics. However, Juárez's life took a pivotal turn when he decided to leave his village at the age of 12 in search of education and opportunity. He walked to the city of Oaxaca, where he began working as a domestic servant in the household of Antonio Maza. This decision marked the beginning of his transformation. Maza's family, especially his daughter Margarita, who would later become Juárez's wife, played a crucial role in supporting his aspirations. Through his work and through contacts in the Maza household, Juárez gained access to educational institutions that would change the trajectory of his life. One of the most significant aspects of Juárez's early years in Oaxaca City was his enrollment in a seminary, the traditional path for indigenous and poor mestizo boys who showed academic promise. It is notable that Juárez never intended to pursue a religious vocation. Rather, he saw the seminary as a means to an education. This choice illustrates his pragmatic approach to opportunity, one that would characterize his political strategies in later life. He excelled in Latin, philosophy, and moral sciences, acquiring the intellectual foundation necessary for his future legal studies. Following his time in the seminary, Juárez entered the Institute of Sciences and Arts of Oaxaca, a secular and progressive institution known for its liberal curriculum. There, he studied law, a discipline that would become his lifelong profession and the platform for his political ascent. His decision to become a lawyer was not merely a professional ambition. It was a conscious act of social assertion in a society where indigenous people were systematically denied rights and legal standing. Law offered Juárez a tool to contest inequality using the very mechanisms of the state. Juárez's intellectual development during this time coincided with the liberal Enlightenment ideas circulating throughout Latin America and Europe. The concepts of secularism, rational governance, and civic equality found fertile ground in his thinking. As he began to articulate a vision for a more inclusive Mexico, his indigenous identity remained central. Unlike many contemporaries who abandoned their roots for acceptance, Juárez maintained his cultural identity while advocating for a nation where all individuals, regardless of race or class, could access justice and opportunity. The region of Oaxaca, with its diverse indigenous populations and long history of resistance to central authority, shaped Juárez's understanding of federalism and autonomy. His upbringing gave him a deep sensitivity to the marginalization of local communities, which later informed his opposition to centralized, authoritarian rule. He believed in a decentralized political structure that allowed states to govern themselves within a constitutional framework. These ideas would later form the backbone of his political ideology. In a broader historical context, Juárez's early life occurred during a period of national transformation. Mexico had recently gained independence from Spain in 1821, and the nation was grappling with instability, economic uncertainty, and competing visions for governance. This chaotic post-independence environment meant that social mobility, while rare, was not impossible. The old colonial hierarchies were in flux, and Juárez seized this narrow opening to challenge the entrenched caste system. Juárez's rise from a rural, monolingual Zapotec background to a position of legal and intellectual prominence in Oaxaca was emblematic of a broader aspiration within 19th-century liberal thought, the creation of a meritocratic society. His story was not just a personal triumph, but a challenge to the dominant racial and social order. He demonstrated that intellectual capacity and civic virtue were not confined to those of European descent or elite lineage. In doing so, he became a symbol of indigenous possibility in a nation long plagued by colonial inequality. In the bustling colonial city of Oaxaca during the early 19th century, education remained a privilege tightly held by the Criollo and Mestizo elites. Yet, within the aging stone walls of the Institute of Sciences and Arts of Oaxaca, a quiet revolution was underway. It was in these halls that Benito Juárez, a determined young man of indigenous heritage, began to forge an intellectual identity that would shape the fate of a nation. His entrance into the Institute in 1827 marked a pivotal departure from the rural constraints of his upbringing and a deep immersion into the world of liberal thought, science, and law. The Institute itself stood as a beacon of secular and rational education in a country still steeped in ecclesiastical authority. Founded during a period of national transformation, its curriculum was reflective of Enlightenment ideals and emerging Republican values. The shift away from clerical instruction toward the natural and social sciences attracted a new generation of reform-minded students and teachers. Juárez, with his characteristic discipline and clarity of purpose, quickly distinguished himself among his peers. He pursued legal studies with the intent not merely to practice law, but to understand the mechanics of justice in a fractured society. He was particularly drawn to subjects that dealt with civic order, individual rights, and institutional reform. Influenced by thinkers such as Montesquieu and Rousseau, whose works were introduced through liberal professors, Juárez began to conceptualize the law as a tool for societal change rather than as a system of control. He was captivated by the idea that a well-ordered republic could protect the rights of all its citizens, especially those historically silenced. This philosophy would later serve as the foundation of his political ideology, but at this stage, it manifested as a profound dedication to his studies. Despite financial hardship, Juárez maintained a rigorous academic routine. He often worked long hours copying legal texts or translating Latin passages to support himself. There are accounts of him studying by candlelight well into the night, his books spread across a modest wooden table. The solitude of these moments, punctuated only by the rustle of parchment and the distant sounds of Oaxaca's streets, honed his sense of perseverance. He did not possess the social networks of his peers, but he compensated through academic excellence and a quiet, unrelenting determination. His peers and professors alike began to take notice. Though he was reserved in manner, Juárez's sharp intellect and unwavering moral compass earned him both admiration and cautious curiosity. For many, he was an anomaly, an indigenous man not only fluent in Spanish, but also proficient in Latin and legal reasoning. His classmates debated with him not out of politeness, but because he held his ground with logic and a keen understanding of law. Within this predominantly mestizo and Criollo environment, he neither assimilated completely nor stood apart with resentment. He walked a delicate line, always conscious of the expectations that weighed on him. Outside the classroom, Juárez began to engage with broader intellectual currents sweeping across Latin America. The decline of colonial authority and the birth of independent republics had ignited debates about governance, citizenship, and national identity. Newspapers, pamphlets, and student societies in Oaxaca contributed to this ferment. Juárez participated discreetly, writing short essays on civil liberties and the role of law in public life. Though not yet a public figure, he was developing the voice that would one day command national attention. His time at the Institute also introduced him to the legal profession's structural mechanisms. Through internships and apprenticeships in local law offices, Juárez encountered the everyday workings of the courts and municipal institutions. These experiences revealed the deep inequities embedded in the justice system. He witnessed cases where the poor were sentenced with little defense and where indigenous litigants were dismissed on technicalities. Far from discouraging him, these injustices solidified his belief that the law could be reclaimed as an instrument of equality rather than oppression. Upon earning his law degree in 1834, Juárez did not immediately seek wealth or status. Instead, he returned to local administration and began offering legal counsel to people with limited means. He believed that the dignity of a nation was measured by how it treated its most vulnerable citizens. This phase of his life laid the groundwork for his future reforms and public service. He approached law as both a vocation and a moral duty, an extension of the same ideals that had shaped his intellectual formation. The symbolic weight of his graduation cannot be overstated. For an indigenous man to emerge from a prestigious institute with formal legal credentials was a radical disruption of the social order. But Juárez wore his achievement with humility. He did not see education as a trophy, but as a tool, one he intended to wield carefully, strategically, and in service of the public good. In a country where the memory of colonial caste divisions still lingered, his presence as a learned indigenous professional was both inspiring and unsettling to the status quo. As Benito Juárez transitioned from student to practicing lawyer in the mid-1830s, he quickly discovered that the courtroom was only one of many theaters where justice could be pursued. Oaxaca, his adopted city, was a complex mosaic of colonial architecture, indigenous markets, clerical influence, and Creole privilege. It was within this intricate social framework that Juárez's political consciousness began to evolve. The cases he took, the clients he defended, and the injustices he observed all pointed to a deeper truth: that meaningful change could not be achieved solely through legal mechanisms. It required political power. Juárez's entry into public service began modestly, yet deliberately. In 1831, he was appointed to the Oaxaca City Council, a position that allowed him to observe local governance closely. Though limited in scope, the council position gave him access to administrative records, tax documents, and regulatory codes. Insights that deepened his understanding of how institutions either uplift or oppress communities. What he saw were patterns of systemic neglect, particularly in indigenous communities where taxes were levied unfairly and services scarcely reached. These revelations stirred in him a growing belief that justice must be pursued through structural reform, not just legal advocacy. By the early 1840s, Juárez had already earned a reputation for his integrity and calm resolve. He did not rely on fiery rhetoric or charismatic theatrics. Rather, he was admired for his sober judgment, his deep sense of duty, and his incorruptible character. These qualities drew the attention of state authorities, and in 1841 he was appointed as a civil judge in Oaxaca. In this capacity, Juárez demonstrated an unwavering commitment to impartiality. He insisted that all cases, regardless of the party's social status, be evaluated with rigor and according to the law. His rulings often favored the poor and marginalized, not out of sentimentality, but because the evidence demanded it. His performance as a judge catapulted him into the broader political arena. In 1846, following the liberal resurgence during Mexico's intermittent shifts between centralist and federalist rule, Juárez was elected as a deputy to the Oaxaca state legislature. This position marked his formal integration into the liberal movement that sought to redefine Mexico in the wake of Spanish colonialism. The legislature became his laboratory for reform, where he pushed for new civil codes, transparency in government contracts, and the redistribution of underutilized church lands for public use, ideas that would later become national in scale. During this period, Juárez also became a vocal advocate for public education. He introduced proposals to expand secular schooling in Oaxaca and redirect public funds away from religious institutions and toward teacher training and school infrastructure. His speeches in the legislature, while measured, revealed his growing belief that a republic could only be sustained by an educated citizenry. To Juárez, education was not merely a service. It was the foundation of democracy and the only sustainable path out of inherited social hierarchies. The political turbulence of the 1840s and early 1850s further tested Juárez's resolve. Mexico was suffering from a crisis of identity and direction, oscillating between liberal and conservative ideologies, federalism and centralism, civilian rule and military coups. Juárez remained steadfastly aligned with the liberal camp, which advocated for a constitutional government, individual rights, and a secular state. He increasingly viewed the military's involvement in politics and the clergy's grip on civil life as dual threats to national progress. In private conversations with allies, he often warned that without deep structural change, Mexico would remain trapped in cycles of instability and injustice. In 1847, Juárez was elected to the National Congress during the height of the Mexican-American War. The occupation of Mexico City by U.S. forces and the looming threat of territorial loss brought national politics into sharp focus. Though he did not participate directly in the military aspects of the war, Juárez's legislative efforts during this period emphasized national sovereignty, constitutionalism, and the urgent need to modernize Mexico's institutions to withstand foreign pressures. The humiliation of the war and the loss of half of the country's territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo served to further radicalize liberal thinkers like Juárez. Returning to Oaxaca after his term in Congress, Juárez found the political landscape increasingly polarized. In 1849, he was elected governor of Oaxaca, a position that allowed him, for the first time, to put his ideas into action on a regional scale. His administration prioritized infrastructure development, particularly the construction of roads and bridges to connect remote indigenous communities with markets and services. He initiated a cadastral survey to regularize land tenure, aiming to protect small landholders from encroachment by large estates and religious orders. These reforms were not only pragmatic, they were ideological, designed to dismantle feudal structures that had survived long after independence. Even as he assumed greater administrative responsibility, Juárez never abandoned his legal principles. He continued to revise civil codes, standardize judicial procedures, and advocate for the professionalization of public servants. He believed that the state should be governed by laws, not personalities, a principle that placed him at odds with many caudillos, or strongmen, who dominated Mexican politics at the time. Juárez envisioned a republic where power was derived not from lineage or force, but from merit and adherence to the Constitution. When Benito Juárez assumed the governorship of Oaxaca in 1847, The state was reeling from decades of neglect, poverty, and institutional disorder. The countryside was dotted with isolated indigenous villages lacking roads, schools, and basic public services. The cities, meanwhile, were under the sway of powerful local elites, many of whom resisted reforms that might weaken their grip on land and influence. Yet Juarez entered office with an unshakable resolve to modernize the region, applying his methodical approach to governance in the face of entrenched resistance and limited resources. One of Juarez's earliest priorities as governor was infrastructure. He understood that Oaxaca's mountainous terrain had long isolated communities and hindered economic development. Under his administration, road-building projects were initiated to connect the interior with the more commercially active areas. These were not grand highways, but modest, functional routes built with local labor and materials. Their significance, however, extended far beyond transportation. They represented a literal and symbolic effort to unite a fragmented state under a shared civic identity. In tandem with infrastructure, Juarez began the reorganization of Oaxaca's public administration. The state government was notoriously inefficient, with disorganized records, lax financial controls, and widespread corruption. Juarez implemented systematic bookkeeping practices and held public officials accountable for the first time. Budget transparency became a central pillar of his administration. He introduced audits, required detailed expense reports, and reined in the use of state funds for personal or clerical enrichment. These seemingly bureaucratic changes sent a powerful message. The era of impunity was over. Another hallmark of Juarez's governorship was his investment in education. He expanded access to secular primary schooling in both urban and rural areas. Recognizing that Oaxaca's indigenous children were often excluded from formal education, Juarez encouraged the establishment of schools in remote villages and advocated for instruction in Spanish to facilitate integration into national life. He did not, however, seek to erase indigenous identities. Rather, he viewed education as a bridge between cultures, one that could elevate historically marginalized communities without erasing their heritage. In addressing land tenure, Juarez confronted one of the most explosive issues in Oaxaca: the domination of vast tracts of land by the Catholic Church and a handful of aristocratic families. While still bound by the legal framework of the time, Juarez laid the groundwork for the future redistribution of land by conducting surveys and documenting public versus private property. He supported the idea that land should serve a productive function, not remain idle in the hands of absentee landlords. These early efforts anticipated the sweeping reforms he would later help implement on a national level. Resistance to Juarez's reforms was immediate and persistent. Conservative factions, particularly those aligned with the church and military, viewed his policies as subversive. They accused him of undermining tradition and sowing division. Clerics railed against secular schools, fearing they would erode religious authority. Wealthy landowners resisted cadastral surveys, seeing them as precursors to expropriation. Juarez, however, was not easily deterred. He relied on the support of middle-class professionals, small landholders, and a growing cadre of young liberals who admired his disciplined and incorruptible leadership. Juarez's political style was striking in its austerity. He disdained personal glorification and rarely engaged in public spectacle. Instead, he governed from modest offices, dressed simply, and traveled without entourage. His commitment to Republican values was visible not just in policy, but in conduct. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who built personal cults of power, Juarez sought to strengthen institutions. He believed that the dignity of a public official lay not in commanding obedience, but in upholding the law without prejudice. While in office, Juárez also deepened his connections to national liberal leaders. He maintained correspondence with reform-minded politicians in Mexico City and other states, exchanging ideas and aligning strategies. These exchanges helped refine his views on federalism and prepared him for the larger ideological battles to come. Oaxaca became, under his leadership, a microcosm of the liberal agenda, a testing ground for secular governance, civil reform, and economic modernization. Juárez's governorship concluded in 1852, after which he faced a temporary political eclipse. The conservative centralist government of Antonio López de Santa Anna returned to power and forced many liberals, including Juárez, out of public office. Rather than retreating, Juárez entered a period of quiet reflection and legal work, using his exile to sharpen his critique of authoritarianism and prepare for the next phase of political engagement. His time as governor had proven that reform was possible, even if it stirred opposition, when guided by principle and executed with discipline. In 1853, Benito Juárez's political trajectory was violently interrupted. With the return of General Antonio López de Santa Anna to power, the brief resurgence of liberal reforms came to a halt. Santa Anna, who had appointed himself dictator for life, swiftly began purging liberal officials from every level of government. Among those targeted was Juárez, whose steadfast republicanism and reformist record had made him a symbol of liberal integrity. Stripped of his position and accused of subversion, Juárez was arrested and, without trial, exiled from Mexico. He was forced to flee to New Orleans, a bustling port city whose polyglot streets and vibrant intellectual circles became an unexpected refuge. Arriving with few possessions and no official status, Juárez found himself in the unfamiliar role of political exile. Yet, true to his nature, he wasted no time. He immersed himself in study, sharpened his knowledge of international law, and kept close watch on developments in Mexico. In cafes and boarding houses frequented by other political refugees, he engaged in long discussions about constitutionalism, religious reform, and strategies for restoring the republic. In New Orleans, Juárez also experienced firsthand the functioning of a more mature democracy. The relative openness of American civic life, despite its own contradictions, reinforced his belief that constitutional governance, when anchored in strong institutions, could resist despotism. He observed court procedures, public debates, and the role of a free press. These observations further convinced him that Mexico's problem was not a lack of will, but the absence of institutional safeguards. What Mexico needed, in his eyes, was not simply new leaders, but a new political architecture. The exile period was also a time of strategic collaboration. Juárez was not alone in Louisiana. Many of Mexico's brightest liberal minds had sought refuge there, forming a kind of government in waiting. Men like Melchor Ocampo, Ponciano Arriaga, and José María Mata met regularly in clandestine gatherings, where they drafted reform proposals and plotted the restoration of the Federalist Constitution of 1824. Juárez, ever reserved but respected, quickly emerged as a unifying figure within this circle. His disciplined demeanor and commitment to principle contrasted with the volatile passions that often fractured liberal ranks. Throughout these meetings, the exiled liberals began articulating what would later become the foundation of the reform laws. They debated the limits of ecclesiastical power, the role of the military in civil society, and the necessity of separating church and state. Juárez, drawing on his experiences in Oaxaca, argued forcefully that without land reform and the secularization of education and governance, Mexico would remain mired in inequality and authoritarianism. He was not merely reacting to Santa Anna's tyranny. He was envisioning a radically new republic. While the political planning was intense, life in exile was far from comfortable. Juarez lived in modest lodgings and took on menial jobs to sustain himself, including work as a clerk and translator. Yet he bore this phase with stoicism. Rather than view hardship as humiliation, he saw it as part of the greater struggle for national redemption. He wrote letters to friends and family back in Oaxaca, always maintaining a tone of hope, never betraying bitterness. He remained grounded, seeing in every challenge an opportunity to prepare for what lay ahead. By 1854, the tide began to turn. A liberal uprising known as the Plan de Ayutla, led by General Juan Alvarez in the state of Guerrero, ignited a wave of resistance against Santa Anna's dictatorship. Though still in exile, Juarez lent his full support to the movement. He corresponded with rebel leaders, encouraged unity among liberal factions, and advocated for a national Congress to draft a new constitution. The success of the rebellion was slow but steady. Santa Anna's regime began to crumble under military and popular pressure. In 1855, Santa Anna fled the country, and the liberals, many of whom had spent years in exile, were invited back to participate in the new government. Juarez returned to Mexico not as a passive observer, but as a key architect of the political transformation now underway. The country he re-entered was in crisis. The treasury was empty, institutions were in disarray, and the nation remained deeply divided. But for Juarez, it was a moment of rare clarity. After years of intellectual labor and political sacrifice, he now had the opportunity to help reshape the nation in accordance with the ideals he had cultivated for decades. Soon after his return, Juarez was appointed Minister of Justice under President Alvarez. It was a decisive appointment. In this role, he began drafting legislation that would strip the clergy and military of their special legal privileges, an early move in what would become the sweeping reforma. These are not theoretical exercises. Juarez understood the law as a living instrument, capable of dismantling centuries of entrenched privilege. The time for ideas had passed. Now came the time for action. When Benito Juárez returned to Mexico and assumed the position of Minister of Justice in 1855, he entered a government eager for change but deeply fragmented by competing visions. The liberal movement, despite its shared rejection of Santa Anna's dictatorship, was far from monolithic. There were moderate reformers who preferred gradual change and institutional compromise, and there were radicals who demanded swift, revolutionary transformations. Juarez stood firmly among the latter, convinced that without profound structural reform, Mexico would remain shackled to the legacies of colonialism, feudalism, and ecclesiastical dominance. One of his first major contributions as Minister of Justice was the enactment of the Ley Juarez, Juarez Law, promulgated in November 1855. This groundbreaking legislation abolished the fueros, special legal privileges that had long protected the clergy and military from being tried in civil courts. For centuries, members of these two powerful estates had existed above the law, accountable only to their own tribunals. Juarez's law directly challenged this legal immunity and marked a seismic shift toward the principle of equality before the law. It signaled that the Republic would no longer tolerate parallel systems of justice based on rank or institution. The Ley Juarez was only the beginning. Alongside a cadre of fellow reformers, Miguel Lerdo de Tejada, Melchor Ocampo, and others, Juarez participated in shaping a suite of legal initiatives aimed at dismantling the colonial structures embedded in the Mexican Republic. Among these was the Ley Lerdo, which targeted the vast holdings of the Catholic Church by forcing it to sell off property not used for strictly religious purposes. The intent was to break up monopolistic land ownership and stimulate a more dynamic, decentralized land market accessible to smallholders and middle-class buyers. These legislative measures were not merely economic or legal reforms. They were an ideological offensive. Juárez and his allies envisioned a secular, rational state governed by civic law, not ecclesiastical authority. In their view, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the church represented an existential threat to republicanism. By limiting clerical influence, they hoped to democratize both economic opportunity and political representation. The reforms were crafted with meticulous care and passed through intense political negotiation, but they were also deeply provocative to conservative sectors of society. Resistance to the reform laws was swift and fierce. Conservative factions, including powerful landowners, church leaders, and remnants of the military elite, denounced the changes as an assault on the moral and spiritual fabric of the nation. The Catholic Church, in particular, condemned the new laws from the pulpit, declaring them sacrilegious and urging followers to resist them. Civil unrest began to spread, especially in rural areas where priests held deep influence over the daily lives of their congregations. What had begun as a legislative project now threatened to plunge the country in a civil war. Juárez remained undeterred. He understood the volatility of the moment, but he believed that the liberal project required unwavering resolve. In 1857, he played a key role in the drafting and adoption of the Constitution of 1857, which enshrined many of the reforms in a national law. The new Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, civil marriage, and the separation of church and state. It also reaffirmed the right to private property and the abolition of special legal privileges. Though it was a product of compromise, the document represented the most progressive legal charter Mexico had seen. However, the promulgation of the Constitution was the final spark that ignited the war of reform, a bitter civil conflict between liberals and conservatives that would ravage the country for 3 years. Juárez, by then appointed president of the Supreme Court, making him second in line for the presidency, found himself at the center of the unfolding crisis. While moderates attempted to mediate, Juárez prepared for an ideological confrontation that would determine whether Mexico would be ruled by tradition or transformed by law. During the early stages of the conflict, Juárez worked tirelessly to ensure that liberal institutions would not collapse under the pressure of armed insurrection. He coordinated with regional leaders, kept reformist legislators unified, and used his legal expertise to craft wartime decrees that maintained the legitimacy of the constitutional government. As the conflict intensified, Juárez would soon find himself thrust into the presidency, an office he had not actively sought, but one that history would soon place firmly upon his shoulders. What defined Juárez during this volatile phase was his unwavering commitment to principle. Unlike many of his contemporaries who wavered or compromised under pressure, Juárez maintained a calm, analytical demeanor. He believed that the laws of the Republic were more than statutes. They were moral instruments, meant to guide the nation through its darkest hours. Even when civil institutions crumbled and rebel armies threatened the capital, Juárez insisted on the rule of law. His speeches avoided bombast, but carried the weight of conviction and foresight. By the close of 1857, Mexico had entered a period of profound internal rupture. The ideological clash between liberals and conservatives had escalated beyond political tension and spilled violently into the streets, towns, and countryside. The reform laws and the 1857 Constitution had triggered not just legal and ecclesiastical controversy, but an existential battle for the soul of the nation. Benito Juárez, elevated to the presidency after Ignacio Comonfort's resignation, found himself presiding over a deeply fractured country, with parallel governments competing for legitimacy. The War of Reform officially began in early 1858, and Juárez's constitutional government, though legally grounded, faced immense practical challenges. Conservative generals had seized control of Mexico City and established a rival regime, proclaiming the illegitimacy of the liberal constitution and denouncing Juárez as a usurper. As president, Juárez was forced to evacuate the capital and relocate his government to the city of Veracruz, a strategic port that offered both military defensibility and access to foreign support. Juárez's government in Veracruz operated under constant threat. Conservative forces, backed by influential clerical figures and foreign sympathizers, launched repeated offensives to capture liberal strongholds. In the face of military inferiority and financial instability, Juárez exhibited extraordinary resolve. He mobilized what resources he could: taxes on imports, voluntary contributions from sympathizers, and emergency loans, to maintain a functioning administration. Even in wartime, he insisted on bureaucratic order, legal formality, and adherence to Republican principles. As battles raged across the nation, in Guanajuato, Michoacán, Zacatecas, and Puebla, the war revealed its deeper dimensions. It was not simply a contest between two political factions, but between two visions of society. Conservative forces championed the preservation of religious authority, centralized government, and social hierarchy. The liberals, under Juárez's leadership, envisioned a modern republic guided by constitutional law, secular institutions, and economic pluralism. Each side viewed the other not merely as opponents, but as traitors to Mexico's future. In the midst of this turmoil, Juárez made crucial diplomatic overtures. He recognized the importance of international perception and sought to portray his government as the legitimate representative of the Mexican people. Through careful negotiation, he won the recognition of the United States, a key victory that bolstered the moral and political standing of a liberal cause. This recognition also opened avenues for limited military aid and financial credit, resources desperately needed to sustain the resistance. Life in wartime Veracruz was harsh. Disease, hunger, and constant alarms were part of daily existence for Juárez and his cabinet. Yet his discipline never wavered. He maintained a strict routine, worked long hours, and expected the same from those around him. He received reports from the front, issued orders with precision, and frequently corresponded with generals and governors. Despite the chaos, he never adopted the trappings of a military leader. His identity remained that of a civil magistrate, a president who ruled through law rather than charisma or force. As the war dragged on, the tide began to shift in favor of the liberals. Conservative overreach, poor coordination, and growing discontent in the territories they controlled eroded their support. Liberal generals such as Santos de Gallardo and Jesus González Ortega began to retake strategic cities, while guerrilla groups in rural areas harassed conservative supply lines. The moral authority of Juárez's administration, anchored in its adherence to constitutional legitimacy, began to yield political dividends. In 1860, the Liberal Army secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Calpulalpan, effectively ending the Civil War. Juárez returned triumphantly to Mexico City in January 1861, greeted by supporters who hailed him not only as a war leader, but as the savior of the Republic. The capital bore the scars of conflict, with government buildings damaged and institutions in disarray, but Juárez approached the task of reconstruction with his characteristic sobriety and focus. There was no celebration or self-congratulation. only work to be done. The war had exacted a terrible toll. Thousands dead, the economy shattered, and a society left deeply polarized. Juarez knew that victory on the battlefield was not enough. The reforms still needed to be institutionalized, and the power of reactionary elements remained potent, even if disorganized. He moved quickly to restore order, revive the civil service, and reassure foreign creditors of Mexico's commitment to stability. Yet, even as he focused on domestic rebuilding, new clouds were gathering on the international horizon. Barely had the dust of civil war settled when Benito Juárez was confronted with a new, even more formidable adversary: foreign intervention. In 1861, the Republic of Mexico, financially exhausted after years of internal conflict, found itself unable to meet its foreign debt obligations. Juárez, now governing a fractured and economically ruined country, issued a 2-year moratorium on the repayment of Mexico's external debts. While intended as a temporary measure, it sparked a swift and aggressive reaction from European powers, chiefly France, Britain, and Spain. These nations formed a tripartite alliance and dispatched military forces to the Gulf Coast under the pretense of collecting on unpaid debts. While Britain and Spain were largely content with diplomatic assurances and guarantees, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, had more ambitious plans, concealing imperial motives behind the veneer of financial enforcement. The French aimed to install a sympathetic monarchy in Mexico. Their objective was geopolitical, to extend French influence in the Americas while counterbalancing the United States, which was then embroiled in its own civil war. As French troops advanced inland, Juárez made the fateful decision to relocate his government once again, this time embarking on a peripatetic existence that would span nearly 5 years. From city to city, state to state, Juárez led a government in exile within his own country. He refused to surrender Mexico's sovereignty, even as the invading army occupied Mexico City in 1863 and installed Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico. Juárez categorically rejected the legitimacy of the so-called Second Mexican Empire. He refused to abdicate, refused to negotiate with Maximilian, and refused to recognize any decree issued by the imperial regime. From his mobile headquarters, first in San Luis Potosí, then Saltillo, Chihuahua, and eventually El Paso del Norte, modern-day Ciudad Juárez, he maintained the constitutional government, issuing orders, appointing officials, and rallying resistance across the republic. Even in the face of logistical collapse and personal danger, Juárez maintained the legal continuity of the republic. Despite overwhelming odds, Juárez never sought refuge abroad. He believed that the moral strength of the republic lay in its unbroken presence on national soil. Even when the French army controlled most major cities, Juárez counted on the loyalty of rural militias, indigenous communities, and liberal military leaders who waged guerrilla warfare in mountains, deserts, and jungles. It was a war not only for territory, but for national identity, and Juárez became the living embodiment of constitutional resistance. The imperial court in Mexico City, meanwhile, attempted to legitimize itself through pomp, pageantry, and promises of reform. Maximilian, though well-meaning and liberal-minded in certain respects, was hopelessly out of touch with the country he now claimed to rule. His decrees were issued in ornate French, disconnected from the lived realities of the Mexican people. He alienated conservatives by refusing to fully restore church power and failed to win over liberals, who viewed him as a foreign interloper imposed by bayonets. Juárez remained unmoved by Maximilian's overtures. Offers of amnesty, high office, or comfortable exile were rejected without hesitation. He believed that accepting any arrangement with the empire would mean surrendering the principle of national self-determination. In Juarez's eyes, the republic was not simply a form of government. It was a commitment to sovereignty, law, and the dignity of the Mexican people. To compromise would mean betraying everything he had fought for during the reform. The tide began to turn in 1865 as the American Civil War ended and the United States shifted its attention to Mexico. The Monroe Doctrine, which had long warned European powers against interference in the Americas, now gained teeth. Under diplomatic and military pressure from the United States, France began withdrawing its forces from Mexican territory. At the same time, liberal Mexican generals, bolstered by renewed support and increasing public discontent with imperial rule, began reclaiming key territories. By early 1867, Maximilian's empire was crumbling. French troops had departed, and the imperial army, composed largely of conscripts and foreign mercenaries, was collapsing under coordinated attacks from Juarez's loyalist forces. The decisive blow came with the siege of Querétaro, where Maximilian was captured after a long and futile defense. Juarez, ever consistent in his adherence to Republican law, convened a military tribunal. Despite international appeals for clemency, Maximilian was executed, bringing a symbolic and definitive end to the imperial experiment. The return of Benito Juárez to the National Palace in 1867 marked more than a political restoration. It was the symbolic culmination of nearly a decade of constitutional struggle. Yet even in the aftermath of victory, Mexico was far from tranquil. The country was devastated. Its infrastructure was in ruins, its finances depleted, and its citizens weary from years of war. Juarez faced a monumental task, not only in rebuilding institutions, but in reuniting a fragmented society. Victory had brought sovereignty, but peace demanded reconciliation and pragmatic governance. One of Juarez's first actions was to convene Congress and restore the constitutional processes interrupted by years of occupation and civil strife. He moved quickly to re-establish civil registries, normalize judicial operations, and reinforce federal authority in states where regional caudillos had operated with near-total autonomy. Although a civilian by formation, Juarez understood that restoring legal order required a delicate balance between central authority and respect for local governance. His leadership during this period was marked by measured decision-making and institutional rigor. The president also resumed his reform agenda, though with a more cautious hand than in previous years. He prioritized the full implementation of the reform laws, particularly those concerning the separation of church and state. Churches were required to relinquish properties that had been spared under the empire, and civil marriage and secular education were once again enforced as pillars of the new republic. Juarez resisted calls for vengeance against former imperial sympathizers, choosing instead a path of legal accountability and conditional amnesty, an approach that underscored his preference for law over retaliation. Economically, the republic was on life support. Years of conflict had annihilated commerce, agriculture, and public credit. Juarez's administration initiated a recovery program focused on infrastructure, rebuilding roads, telegraph lines, and rail projects that had stalled under occupation. Foreign investment was courted with caution, particularly from the United States and Britain, both of which had begun to reassess Mexico as a potential economic partner rather than a geopolitical pawn. Juarez insisted that any agreements respect national sovereignty, an insistence born of hard experience. Education was another of Juarez's top priorities. As a man who had risen from illiteracy to leadership through learning, he believed that an educated citizenry was essential to the survival of democracy. His government expanded the reach of secular public schools, particularly in indigenous and rural areas, and supported the training of new teachers. The curriculum emphasized civic responsibility, science, and Mexican history, tools meant to cultivate a sense of national identity that transcended regional and class divisions. Politically, however, Juárez's position was far from unassailable. Though he had led the Republic through its gravest trials, many of his former allies had grown uneasy with the concentration of power in his hands. Critics accused him of autocratic tendencies, particularly after he announced his candidacy for re-election in 1871. The principle of non-re-election had been a rallying cry against past dictators, and Juárez's decision to seek another term alienated segments of the liberal camp that had once supported him fervently. Nevertheless, Juárez defended his candidacy as a continuation of the national project. He argued that stability was crucial and that his experience was indispensable in a time when factionalism still threatened Republican unity. The election was closely contested and bitterly divisive. Although Juárez emerged victorious, his legitimacy was now under strain from within the very movement he had once unified. Among the disillusioned was Porfirio Diaz, a young general and national hero of the anti-imperial resistance, who accused Juárez of betraying the ideals of the Republic. The political rift deepened as Diaz launched the Plan de la Noria, a rebellion calling for democratic reform and strict enforcement of term limits. Though the uprising was ultimately unsuccessful, it signaled a turning point. Juárez, who had weathered empires and civil wars, now faced an internal crisis rooted in the contradictions of liberalism itself, between order and liberty, continuity and renewal. The harmony he had hoped to instill in the post-war republic seemed increasingly elusive. In the final years of his presidency, Juárez intensified his efforts to modernize state institutions. He reorganized the military to limit the influence of rogue generals, expanded civil services, and promoted fiscal transparency. Yet he did so under a growing shadow of political isolation. His once celebrated integrity now seemed, to some, like stubbornness. Friends and adversaries alike observed that the weight of years in power had aged him profoundly, both physically and emotionally. He had never sought adoration, but now found himself increasingly bereft of allies. By 1872, Benito Juárez had weathered nearly every storm Mexico could throw at him. The nation, once fractured by internal war and foreign invasion, was slowly being rebuilt, but the personal toll on the president was undeniable. His health, which had always been frail, began to deteriorate as he entered his late 60s. The stresses of leadership, the constant battles for political legitimacy, and the weight of national reconstruction had begun to leave their mark on the man who had become synonymous with Mexican resilience. Juárez had always been a figure of immense discipline. He had never succumbed to the temptations of power, never sought to enrich himself or his family, and remained unwavering in his commitment to law and order. But as his health declined, his determination only seemed to grow more evident. He refused to relinquish his responsibilities, even as his advisors urged him to take rest. His presidency, despite being marred by political tension and ideological divides, had achieved monumental strides for Mexico's modernization. Yet Juárez's greatest legacy lay not in the reforms themselves, but in the very survival of the Republic. In the months leading to his death, Juárez remained in office, even as his condition worsened. His frailty became more apparent with each passing day. He had lost much of his youthful vigor, the sharpness of his once keen mind dulled by age and illness. Still, he persevered. His final days in office were marked by a deep sense of responsibility. He sought to ensure that the Republic could continue on the path of liberalism, even if he himself would not be there to lead it. In 1872, with Juárez's body now too weak to carry on, his political adversaries and supporters alike began to accept the inevitability of his passing. His closest allies, such as Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, began to prepare for a future without their beloved president. On July 18, 1872, Benito Juárez passed away in the city of Ciudad Juárez, named in part after the man who had defended the Republic during its darkest hours. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of the enduring memory of his work and ideals. The funeral of Benito Juárez was a moment of national reflection, an occasion that transcended party lines. People from all walks of life mourned the loss of their leader. Crowds lined the streets, and a somber silence fell across the country as Mexico paid its respects to the man who had saved the Republic from both internal and external threats. For many, Juárez was not simply a president. He was the embodiment of the Mexican ideal, a person who had risen from humble origins to shape the destiny of a nation, driven by a profound sense of justice and duty. Though Juárez's death marked the end of his direct influence, his ideals lived on. His legacy was codified in the very structures of the modern Mexican state. The reforms he initiated, from the separation of church and state to the promotion of civil rights, endured long after his passing. The reform laws became a cornerstone of Mexico's Republican identity, while his insistence on the rule of law over military might influence generations of Mexican leaders. His death also opened a new chapter for the Porfiriato, a period that would see his one-time ally, Porfirio Diaz, rise to power. Diaz, who had rebelled against Juárez's decision to seek re-election, ultimately became the dominant force in Mexican politics for the next several decades. Yet even under Diaz's authoritarian regime, the country still felt the weight of Juárez's moral and institutional legacy. His vision of a secular, Republican Mexico, one based on legal equality and democratic principles, remained an aspirational standard, even as the realities of governance diverged. Juárez's influence was also keenly felt in the broader cultural and intellectual spheres. Writers, philosophers, and educators throughout Mexico and Latin America regarded him as a model of integrity and political courage. The Juárez Law and his unrelenting defense of constitutionalism became important symbols of the broader Latin American struggle for independence from colonial legacies. Juárez's name, in fact, became synonymous with the fight for justice and sovereignty across the Americas, especially as Mexico's influence in the region began to shift in the late 19th century. While his presidency may have been marked by internal struggles, political polarization, and personal sacrifice, Benito Juárez's death did not dim the brilliance of his legacy. His impact was enduring, and his place in Mexican history was cemented as one of its most revered figures. In the centuries that followed, his name was invoked by political leaders, activists, and citizens alike, who saw in his story a reflection of Mexico's own struggles for democracy, independence, and national unity. Today, Benito Juárez is remembered in Mexico not only as a president, but as a national hero. His image adorns monuments, schools, and streets across the country, from the majestic Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City to small towns in the rural heartland. His birthday, March 21st, is celebrated as a national holiday, reflecting his central role in the creation of the modern Mexican state. Beyond the borders of Mexico, Juárez is hailed as a symbol of the struggle for justice and the perseverance of the human spirit. His story remains a beacon of hope for those who seek equality, liberty, and the triumph of law over tyranny. As Mexico continues to evolve, Juárez's legacy serves as both a touchstone and a challenge. A reminder that true democracy is built not only on laws, but on the unyielding will to protect and uphold them, no matter the cost.